Was it destiny for Zuko to become the hero we love? How much control do we have over our own actions? Are hatred or revenge rational? Did Ozai deserve the death penalty? How many rhetorical questions are too many in the opening of a video? This is my partner, Kim. She grew up in Thailand, so there are many American things she hasn't experienced.
This is Kim's first time using a water fountain.
So I gave her some homework before she was allowed to go to the party that everyone else wanted to go to. Get out. Get out of here. I don't want you. Get out. Alright. While I rewatched Avatar: The Last Airbender, the themes of self-control, destiny, and revenge stuck out to me, because they're very related to a topic that was already on my mind. Free will. So let's slightly pretentiously use the themes and characters of this children's anime, Fight Me, to examine this freedom of will we cling so tightly to. But I believe Kim can save the world. Oh, and while I'm at it, let's call for a complete overhaul of the American criminal justice system. And I haven't even had my morning diet root beer.
You've always thrown everything you could at me. Well, I can take it, and now I can give it back! Come on! You've never held back before!
Right. The Avatar state is a powerful trance that, before mastery, consumes the will of our otherwise normal shonen protagonist, Aang Airbender.
Believe it!
While overcome, Mr. Airbender is swept up by the ocean of his ancestors' wills. He's no longer an agent capable of voluntary actions. Instead, he is helpless before this wave of forced directives. I'm sure your 10-year-old self thought the same thing. This is our modern 21st century conception of free will. We are agents, except in the most extreme circumstances. For an unlucky few, people with schizophrenia, dementia, brain damage, or Mr. Airbender in his avatar state, free will can be subtracted from most or all of their actions. But the everyday person is the definitive and only captain of their ship, right? Take Zuko. His combustible struggle against destiny is empowering to witness. From his birth, every influence burned away individuality and hope for normalcy. If it were not for the humanity smoldering within, Zuko's destiny would have certainly been in the shadow of his father's flame.
Blame you, Hotman!
But whatever it is that makes Zuko Zuko pushed for a different path. His own path. To examine this more closely, let's compare Zuko to his Wayward Fire-Sibling. At first glance, Zuko and Azula have all of the same environmental factors going for them. Not to mention they're siblings and share much of their genetic makeup. Yes, I'm aware they're just anime characters. Again, fight me. They live within the same family structure. They grew up in the same nationalistic, power-hungry culture. They are both magical firebenders, and so on. You might be tempted to condemn Azula for siding with her father's aggressive war state, and to praise Zuko for ultimately rejecting that way of life. In practice, however, their influences are significantly different. For starters, Azula was born lucky. Zuko?
I was lucky to be born.
Azula excelled in seemingly all things. She excelled in firebending, academic pursuits,
Their defenses burned to a crisp in minutes.
Correct, my dear.
manipulation,
We are brother and sister. It's important for us to spend time together. Don't you think so, Mom?
and she fell into the Princess of the Fire Nation role easily. While being a prince in his own right certainly came with perks, Zuko was comparatively unfortunate. He was a strong enough firebender, but nowhere near the competence of his sister, and perhaps more importantly, nowhere near the expectations of his father. Zuko was empathetic enough and friendly enough to, well, actually relate to people, so he never practiced manipulation as a first resort. and as evidenced by the scar burned into his face, his role as prince did not come easily to him. Take a moment to think of yourself as Azula. Really try to put yourself in her shoes. She was born into a royal family, and not just any royal family, the royal family currently in the process of dominating the world. She was born excelling at a magic art that not all people in the world even possess. Shunned by her mother, she sought recognition from her father. All normal people around her are forced to worship her very existence, and she likely has some species of psychopathy. If this was your life, would you have come to the conclusion that your divine right to rule is ultimately worth questioning? Would you have thought that your destiny ultimately presides outside of your father's ambitions, perhaps even with his most prolific enemies? And that's it for this episode of the Just Asking Questions podcast. Let's do the same for Zuko. He was born into a royal family, and yet somehow still outcast within it. He was nurtured by people that encouraged his humanity. He was constantly outshadowed by his more talented, more desirable in his father's eyes, more perfect sister. He was banished from the Fire Nation for 3 years, allowing him to grow in the absence of his culture. Given this, it makes perfect sense that Zuko could have ended up as the type of person who had become disillusioned with the system around him. But also, considering that he grew up in the environment and culture of his childhood, it makes perfect sense that this crossroads of destiny could eat away at him for several seasons before he makes the right choice. So we see that Zuko had some things pushing him towards the morally righteous side, and Azula had very little. But, I may hear you say, this doesn't completely remove praise from Zuko or blame from Azula. Let's do this again with another wayward pair of fire siblings, Iroh and Ozai. Iroh had a lust for life. He found joy in simple things: love,
Huge!
companionship, flowers, and, most importantly, being the product of his upbringing, he had internalized many of the destructive values from within his culture.
If we don't burn it to the ground first.
That said, his love and reverence for life shined through even in his early days.
He must have lied to protect them, so no one else would hunt them.
But make no mistake, Iroh is still a war criminal. However, in the face of his son's death, he changed his path. Ozai, by contrast, saw this love of life as a weakness. He viewed this mindset as laziness in the face of glory to be won. Ozai's full embrace of his divine right to rule culminated in the assassination of his father, Fire Lord Azulon. His life's purpose was power, conquest, and ruling. He was also likely afflicted by some species of psychopathy. Now, Iroh's son's death caused a change of heart within him. But is this an accident, given who we know Iroh to be? Is it out of nowhere that someone as reflective and open-minded as Iroh could see the pain of war in others through his own experience? In the hands of Ozai, this tragedy would have seemingly never led to this change of heart. If I were to imagine Azula dying a similar death, I only see rage, disappointment, perhaps, in Azula, potentially a desire for revenge, but I don't see his life's path being altered in the same way Iroh's was. I was originally going to save this for later in the video, but fuck it. Pikachu, pull up Junro, rule 34.
Pika pika!
We as humans are nothing more than our genes and their interactions with environment. Let me explain. First off, this sounds deflationary, but really it's not. Genes may be comparatively limited, but environment is literally everything else that there is. But the point. If you want to talk about someone's motivations, by definition, you must talk about human psychology. If you wish to speak about psychology, you're missing most of the picture if you ignore the physiology of the brain. If you're talking about this physiology, these genes that code for the neurotransmitters, neuroregulators, hormones, and so on, we need to talk about brain development. And to talk about brain development, you can barely start painting a picture without mentioning the environment that molded and influenced it every step of the way. This picture is painted beautifully by neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky in his book Behave. At a base, these are not different disciplines. They're all one vast, interconnecting chain of causes and effects. I know this is sounding a little c***y, but wait, hold on. Where's everyone going? Wait, don't click away. We can go back to the anime. Let's go back to the children's anime. Aang Airbender, please save me. Jesus. In Season 2, Episode 11, our protagonist Aang Airbender is in a tragic position. Aang finds his only living friend from his past culture, Appa, forcibly captured and sold. Not only is this heartbreaking, it's also life-threatening, as Appa is Aang's primary method of travel, and Aang is in the middle of a desert with little supplies. Desperate for shelter and sustenance, Aang and his gang travel into a cave that ends up being home to a colony of monstrous, human-sized flying bugs. That's bad. Momo, the only known descendant of Aang's home culture, is helpless before them. Exhausted, dehydrated, running on lack of sleep and desperate not to lose another friend, another symbol of his home. Aang does this. I find this clip really interesting. Aang was raised vegetarian by Buddhist-inspired monks. He believes revenge to be poisonous. He also possesses a love and reverence for all of life, even in its most despicable forms. The climactic conflict of the show is Aang's unwillingness to kill the main antagonist, Firelord Ozai, despite his genocidal crimes against Aang's own people. So what's he doing killing that bug? Momo is already out of harm's way. And yet, none of us think this is poorly written. None of us think this is a character from a different show. This action is antithetical to virtually every single other one we see Aang make. But we all believe this to be completely possible in this moment. Starving, dehydrated, exhausted, yearning for the return of Appa, and nearly witnessing the abduction of Momo. All of this culminates in Aang breaking his own value system. Revenge is something Aang speaks stubbornly against. But the brain does not produce its motivations or thoughts in a vacuum. For each in-the-moment strike against your better judgment, the more likely we are to fall into the false dichotomy of us and them. The more likely we are to otherize. The more likely we are to desire justice or seek revenge. And in fact, Aang is seen getting revenge against humans in a similar tired, agitated, rageful lust. Upon finding the people who abducted Appa, he destroys, one by one, the Sandbender's gliders. An absolutely crucial form of transportation in the wasteland that surrounds them. Essentially, leaving them for dead. Drawing the same analogy from the beginning of the video, it's no wonder in this emotional turmoil, Aang is helplessly foisted into the Avatar state. It's also telling that Sokka, who knows Aang well, sees this as immediately dangerous, and simply advises everyone to
Just get out of here! Run!
I think most of you can at least see the argument that whenever we're in extreme emotional turmoil, exhausted, starving, intensely stressed, Even if our brains are otherwise healthy and functional, our free will is at best dubiously asserted. We have all done things in similar states that really wouldn't occur to our well-rested, nourished, happy minds. But the point I want to drive home is these are merely the circumstances with obvious, high-pressure influences. Even to our most calm, zen minds, we're still subject to a world of influences. Some known to us, others simply unknowable. Now, I can practically hear your thoughts screaming back at me. What in the flying f*** does a children's anime, fight me, have to do with the free will of real human beings? As a quick defense of this video's intro, analogy, metaphor, comparison. That said, point taken. Let's talk about real life for a bit. I know, it's nice to look at this rectangular portal with me, Pikachu, Pooch, and their eyes staring into your soul, staring into your soul, staring into your soul, staring into your soul, and forget about that droll old thing for a little while, but I got nothing. It is nice to forget about. Anyway, real life. What's your favorite detergent? Answer me. Answer me! Alright, that should be good enough. One of those will work. That's cringe. Whatever your answer to the question, what is your favorite detergent, are you sure? Is that an answer you came to on your own? Is that an answer that could be influenced just based on, I don't know, some words you read earlier today? No. Of course not. Even if you don't have a strong preference, you would still think through the options, come to your own conclusions, like a free thinker podcast. Pikachu, find me my Junro!
Pika-pee!
In the 1977 University of Michigan Review, Telling More Than We Can Know, this is the setup for one of many similar studies. Subjects memorized word pairs such as ocean and moon. Then, after a time delay, they were asked questions with a target response. In this case, Tide being the target of the question, what's your favorite detergent? Ocean, moon, tide, you see the association. The average effect was to double the frequency of the anticipated response. The number of people who said Tide is their favorite detergent went from 10% to 20%, just based on word association. And it's even worse than that. Practically none of the subjects, after being asked open-endedly, mentioned the word pair as causal. They would instead focus on things like, my mother uses Tide, or I like the packaging, to justify their response. In a similarly damning study, subjects were asked which of 4 identical pieces of clothing were of the best quality. Quote, there was a pronounced position effect, such that the rightmost object was heavily overchosen. For one admittedly low sample size example, quote, the rightmost stocking being preferred over the leftmost by a factor of almost 4 to 1. People prefer the rightmost stocking when they're all identical. They are the same. This position effect is also well documented, but why exactly it occurs is unclear. Perhaps Americans read left to right and have a bias towards the last thing they examined. But I bet you can guess one thing that was extremely clear in the minds of the subjects. Position had absolutely no bearing on their decision. Quote, when asked directly about a possible effect of position, virtually all subjects denied it, usually with a worried glance at the interviewer, suggesting that they either felt that they had misunderstood the question or were dealing with a madman. Madman. Great word. I should bring that one back. There are many more such examples in this review from 1977, showcasing demonstrable causes that influence people's behaviors with little or no awareness of said influences. And I didn't pick such an old review because of a lack of replication or examples in modern research. I picked it to showcase how long we have known about effects such as these, how slowly psychology seeps into the cultural consciousness. But lo, I may hear you cry, I shan't be witness to such licentious apocrypha. Detergent? Garments? Bah! These matters are trivial at best. What regard have these to freedom of will? One popular psychology study you have almost certainly tasted through the grapevine is the so-called Stanford marshmallow experiment. For those unfamiliar, children aged roughly 4 were given a marshmallow. For free, too. If they were able to prevent themselves from eating the marshmallow for 15 agonizing minutes, they were given more marshmallows. This is referred to as delay of gratification. This study is especially relevant because of the longitudinal review that came 4 decades later, where some 59 of the original 500 participants were re-evaluated. To summarize in a quote, these findings complement prior work characterizing developmental features of self-regulation by providing further evidence for their predictive validity in subsequent stages of life. This study is prolific to the point of memery. I've even heard erudite jokes from friends of mine to the tune of, "That asshole at the bar seems like one of the kids that ate the marshmallow." Which is pretty funny, but have you ever taken a moment to seriously consider the implications of this and similar studies? The fact that at age 4, we have statistically significant predictors of your fully grown-ass adult life. Predictions such as your vulnerabilities to high BMI, hard drug use, anxiety or personality disorders, and even your likelihood to divorce your future spouse. Seriously, let that sink in. I'm taking this so seriously, I'm resisting the urge to put that picture of Elon Musk after buying Twitter up on your screen. No, down, stay. Good boy. Here's some cryptocurrency. How much control have these children shown in their lives? How deserving of disastrous life outcomes are they? As they grew, how free were they, really? At the risk of driving the point home too hard, let's take a look as far back as one can go in their lifetime. Brain scans on fetuses. To use the words of Robert Sapolsky, fetal environment doesn't begin at birth. It begins at conception. And one of a zillion examples that could be shown is one of those studies that should floor you with how outrageous this implies the universe is. People have gotten good enough at brain imaging techniques that they can do neuroimaging on a fetus. And already, the rate of a fetus's brain growth is influenced by the mother's socioeconomic status. If your mother is poor, a bazillion studies show your brain is more likely to be getting marinated in stress hormones from her circulation. And that delays aspects of brain maturation. You're a fetus, and already you picked the wrong womb to land in. Your mother's socioeconomic status is already beginning to influence what kind of brain you're gonna have as an adult. Look, I don't want you to get the idea that I think we are mere biology. Biology only makes sense in the context of culture and environment. They're inseparable. Take a look at these studies where Asian women were prompted to either think of the Asian part of their identity or the woman part. Those whose Asian identity was more salient performed better on a math test. Those whose woman part of their identity was more salient performed worse. Culture and environment are the cause of these profound effects that these stereotypes have. Or you can look at this study showing that more tired, more burnt out doctors show more implicit racial bias. This causes them to exhibit fewer patient-centered behaviors in clinical interactions with Black patients, which in turn causes patient distrust, lower adherence to treatment plans, and a lower likelihood for follow-up visits. There are some biological determinants here, such as tiredness or the amount of melanin in one's skin. But racial bias is purely the result of culture. The stereotypical beliefs and attitudes that emerge are directly a result of the environment the doctors grew up in. And finally, again at the risk of driving the point home too hard, there is the so-called hungry judge effect. This is a good one to end on, for it marries biology and environment clearly. Over 1,100 judicial rulings during a 10-month period were reviewed, looking for extraneous influences on decision-making. The single best predictor of a favorable ruling for the defendant? Time since the judge's last meal. Defendants had a roughly 65% chance of a favorable ruling at the start of each of 3 daily court sessions. By the end of each session, their chance of a favorable ruling drops to nearly 0. Now, it's worth mentioning that this study is wildly controversial. Much has been said on both sides, many sides. Why does my Trump sound gay? Of course I'm on the right. I want it right in my ass. I'm an impressionist, what can I say? For the most part, this critique takes issue with the scale of the effect, not the effect itself. And the effect itself has actually been replicated in similar domains. If you want a bank loan, make sure to go after lunchtime. However, the effect of hunger on judicial decisions is not one size fits all. For Muslim judges during the month of Ramadan, where adherents fast during daylight hours, judges are actually more lenient with their sentencing. Something about the hunger in their stomach makes them feel a connection with their fellow man or whatever. For me, it's mostly anal that gives me that connection. But the point. There's some aspect of your biology that exists, but it is useless to interpret this without the context of culture and environment. We're most decidedly not just biology. And look, I could sit here for 10 hours quoting study after study, showcasing some new aspect of cognition that takes away a small piece of your agency. I could talk about the brain's readiness potentials that precede your own conscious awareness of your actions by half a second. Or studies where subjects 100% believe themselves to be the author of actions orchestrated by the experimenters. But I don't think we need to talk about neuroscience to dispute free will. Moreover, that wouldn't actually get us very far. Our modern knowledge of neuroscience and psychology and all the rest is vast, but it is indeed incomplete. We don't have a 100% causal picture as to why this serial unaliver unalived people in that way, or why Kim wanted to watch the live-action Avatar before the original anime. But from where I sit, we have more than enough information to look at the whole picture and fill in the gaps. There are so many things that we used to attribute to human agency that are now biological quirks or diseases. Addiction is a disease, not some lack of grit and bootstraps. Dyslexia is a brain malfunction, not lazy children unwilling to learn. Epilepsy and schizophrenia are not a result of people cohorting with Satan. And as Robert Sapolsky likes to say, the toothless woman at the end of the hamlet isn't in charge of the weather, and shouldn't be put to death in some witch hunt. The progress of science will march on, with or without us. Similar to the God of the gaps, free will inevitably shrink ever more into the margins of cognition. It will cling to the neurobiology not yet understood, like its life depends on it. There are a myriad of influences that go into each and every single one of your decisions, and you're aware of little to none of it. Further, you're the author of little to none of it. What effect does your daily hormone fluctuations have on decision-making? Did you choose how much testosterone was going to float in your bloodstream last Tuesday when you flipped off that Kia Soul for merging a little too quickly? What effect did your lack of parents or presence of parents have on your relationship with money, stress, or human connection? Were you born in a culture that has children sleeping with their parents until they're 10, or one where you were put to bed in a different room from the day you came home from the hospital? What bounds does the structure of your primary language place on your thinking? Were you born conventionally attractive? Were people nicer to you because of it? Yes, they were. What gender were you socialized into? What's your sexuality? What's the color of your skin? Did you choose for skin color to matter so goddamned much in our society? When you cried, were you discouraged from doing so? What is your adverse childhood experience, or ACE score? More on that later. What was your childhood socioeconomic status? What country were you born into? What city? What neighborhood? What family? Need I go on? This is all one seamless arc of biology and its interactions with environment. The great discipline, just to give it a pretentious name. We may not have hold of every rung in the ladder of decision-making, just as we may not have hold of every individual skeleton in the evolutionary history of human beings. But it is still rational, and indeed correct, to follow the pattern to its conclusion. In the words of Sean Nichols, it seems like something has to give. Either our commitment to free will, or our commitment to the idea that every event is completely caused by the preceding events. With the help of Aang and his gang, called Gaang apparently, I asked 3 main questions. If you were in that exact position, would you have done otherwise? Is it an accident that this person reacted to this situation in this way? What influences, known and unknown, cause someone to act a specific way? The first question is actually a very common definition of free will. We have free will if and only if we could have done otherwise. Given the exact same set of prior influences, environments, and causes, could you have chosen a different action? If you were Azula, if you grew up in the exact same environment with the exact same genetics, there would be no meaningful distinction between you and her. There's no magical soul being transported between you guys. There is merely her brain and its history. And if your brain had the same origins and history as Azula's, it would be identical to hers. So really, the question doesn't make sense. There's no you being transported into Azula. Another way of saying this is no. We could not have done otherwise. The world we live in is deterministic. Causes precede effects, which result in causes which produce effects. Given the same causes, the effect will be unchanged. There is no we could have done otherwise. We do exactly what is determined to happen, every step of the way. We can even write down the equations that describe how reality will unfold. Now, if this gives you some form of existential anxiety, same. Welcome to my world. But I believe myself later in the video to convincingly argue against free will-based anxiety. I convinced myself, at least. So hold tight, pause the video if you need to, and take some deep breaths. The second question can be reframed in a simple way. Cause and effect. Is it an accident I turned out as I am? No, it's not. It was this web of causes, known and unknown, that created me. It's not an accident, but that doesn't mean the causes are clear. Humans do well with one cause producing one effect. I throw a football. Cause? Me. Effect? Football moving. But would I be able to throw the football without arms? Would I have even seen an American football if I was born in a different country? Would the Earth have supported life in the first place if it was 10% closer to the sun? This is the concept of distributed causality. We don't like to think this way. I don't like to think this way. I'm sure each step I took in that process felt more and more irrelevant in assigning causality to me in a football. But in reality, they are equally relevant. Without arms, I wouldn't be throwing footballs. Is it an accident that Iroh had his change of heart? No, it's not. But it's not as simple as "sun dead, me good now." There is a cacophony of notes being played within Iroh before the crescendo of decision. Each plays its role in creating the harmony he follows, and to take out one note, one influence, is to completely change the project. We are not accidents, but that doesn't mean we can see every single thing that created us. And there isn't one single thing responsible. Finally, what influences, known and unknown, cause someone to act a specific way? Don't worry, I'm not going to start quoting more studies at you. Not yet, anyway. As previously discussed, Aang is subject to a litany of causes assaulting him. All I want to add to the previous discussion is this. These influences are indeed causal. See my selected handful of studies. I whinged on about, at best, free will is dubiously asserted in these extreme cases, but even in our most calm state, we're subject to a world of influences. Influences that sometimes are known and other times unknowable, but still affect our behavior. There are, in my mind, two ways of breaking apart free will. Looking at the litany of prior causes, genes, environment, the unbroken chain of preceding events, and noticing how little of it, if any of it, can be attributed to you. The other way is to just look into your direct experience and examine you more closely. Let's pay attention to what it's like to be conscious for a moment. This is gonna sound weird, but humor me. We have a belief about our experience that's so strong it's fully integrated into our perception of being alive. I believe that I exist behind my eyes, beneath my skull, above my neck. One way to show what I mean is to place an object at your feet, and then place that same object near your head. When does it feel closer to you? Actually try this. People don't feel identical to their bodies, they feel like they have bodies. I have feet, but that foot is not me. When I look into the mirror, I see Ben. Maybe better put, I recognize Ben. To me, Ben is the experience itself of looking out from that image that I can recognize in the mirror. I know, this is sounding vague, unhelpful, and stonerish. If you pay close attention to the thoughts in your mind, they are, in fact, of noticeably mysterious origins. We believe ourselves to be the author of our thoughts, right? I'm the one thinking them, who else would be? But here's a simple point. You cannot think your thoughts before you think them. You don't think, okay, next I'm gonna think this video is stupid and makes no sense. You just have that thought. It simply appears in your consciousness. You don't author your thoughts, you don't write them. You become aware of them. With a purely materialistic examination, thoughts are simply neuronal processes in the brain, unknown, unfelt, uncontrolled by your conscious mind. your experience. You can ruminate on a thought. You can consciously hold on to it. But the origin, unless noticeably prompted by someone yelling, "Don't think about butt plugs," or whatever, is fundamentally mysterious. We are a helpless stream of sensations, sounds, smells, thoughts, and prayers, all presented to our consciousness by the brain. You no more decide the next thing you think than you decide the next thing I say. What are you going to think next? You don't know. Yet your thoughts determine what you want and intend and do next. Your thoughts determine your goals and whether or not you believe you've met them. They determine what you say to other people and what you don't say. In fact, thoughts determine almost everything that makes you human. Most people think they're the thinker of their thoughts and therefore their author. And this is one way of describing the feeling of self. Subjectively speaking, as a matter of experience, there's no thinker to be found in the mind apart from the thoughts themselves. You're as free to think your next thought as you are to not hear the sound of my voice. And yes, ha ha ha, very clever, you can turn the video's volume down. But really think about that. You can't not hear a sound. You can't flip a switch in your consciousness by reciting the sound of silence. You have no choice in your experience of sight or sound or anything else. The brain simply produces it for you. This, I think, gets at the core issue of our false belief in free will. This belief that I am looking out from behind my eyes. The belief that I have my body. But this is simply to reject all of modern neuroscience and biology. I am my body. I am my brain. I am, in fact, identical to this soft flesh prison. I cannot escape it. And if my body becomes damaged beyond repair, there's no ectoplasm, no magic that will float off containing my thoughts, my beliefs, my love of diet root beer. If you meddle with my brain, you meddle with what I am. Our belief about the feeling of free will is inextricably linked to our concept of self. We have this interpretation of the movie playing in our mind that puts an agent, a protagonist, in the center. But this is simply a story device produced by the brain. It may even be a useful fiction, but it is a fiction. There is no you hidden in your experience. The self can be meaningfully called an illusion when talking about this aspect of selfhood. Obviously, you aren't an illusion. You exist. But the concept of a little agent, a ghost in the machine, a me in my brain, is noticeably false. This, I think, is why people defend free will so stubbornly, and why they're often fearful of the idea that free will is an illusion. Their self-conception is strongly linked to this feeling of agency. But this is just an experience we have. The bare facts of experience do not lend themselves to agency. I think it's worth repeating. You cannot think your thoughts before you think them. They simply pop into your awareness without any directive from your conscious mind. Here's a powerful example of this fact. Songs get stuck in your head. The first time you hear Sarah Cothran's cover of As the World Caves In, as the goosebumps tatter your arms and your spine shivers in recognition, you just want to sing it again and again. As the atom bomb. However, at the 100th listen, you do need a break. The song feels a little tired, and you've heard it all before. But that doesn't stop the brain from giving the song to you. It doesn't matter how much you want it to stop. It doesn't matter how annoying it is. The song will simply keep playing, often at the most unexplainable times. I don't know if anyone else is weird in this way, but I often wake up with a song already stuck in my head. My first conscious thought after laying comatose for 8 hours is... And it's all in my head, but she's touching his chest. Now he takes off her dress. Now let me go. I don't even think I've listened to that song in 2024. And yet, it was presented on my brain's morning charcuterie board 2 weeks ago. Me wasn't the thinker of that thought. Well, it was. It was my brain. But it wasn't what I think of as me. The little agent I believe I am wasn't the author of that brain functioning. Unconscious, frequently unknowable processes were the true author. Processes shaped by 27 years of environmental conditioning. Yeah, so I have 2 Edward shirts. There it is. Free will is an illusion. But what do we do with that? What should we do differently? I will get there, but first I want to spend some time explaining and clarifying a few things. First, it's important to note there is still a difference between voluntary and involuntary action. Picking up a canister of holy water and spritzing it on the congregation is still different than your heart beating, or involuntary muscle spasms, or even accidentally pressing the wrong key on a keyboard. Now it smells like linen and sky. Wow. Both of those together. Voluntary action is in fact the more reliable predictor of what you will do in the future. You can even go so far as to say your thoughts are the proximal cause of your voluntary actions. But again, how you became the type of system to produce those thoughts in the first place is ultimately beyond your comprehension or control. You can do what you will, but you cannot will what you will. Originally, I had planned this whole section on compatibilism, but this is too much already. I'll just briefly summarize my problems with it. Everything I've said up to this point is a picture of reality called determinism. Causes precede effects, and there is no magic to be inserted there. Given the same set of influences, the exact same action will occur, again and again. Compatibilism is the philosophical framework that starts here. Determinism is true, but compatibilism believes that free will can still exist on top of that picture. Most modern neuroscientists and philosophers consider themselves compatibilists, so you're in the company of an extremist lunatic. Hey, I didn't make you watch this far into the video. You had no choice. However, it is important to point out that the free will most people believe in and the free will of compatibilism are simply not the same thing. Most people believe they could have done otherwise. Most people believe that they're a little agent in their heads. This is called libertarian free will.
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
And essentially the only modern lines of philosophical thought that believe in it are religious ones. God gave us the freedom to sin so he can shit in the mouths of all those people that follow the gay agenda. Or whatever. Compatibilism really is an attempt to redefine this classical notion of free will. They think of free will as an emergent phenomena, future possibilities, or uncoerced voluntary action. Most people believe in a notion of free will ignored by compatibilists. So compatibilism isn't very relevant here. Jesus. But just so I get my jabs in, compatibilism as an enterprise strikes me as desperately clinging to this idea of free will. It seems a way for heady people to rationalize their belief in modern science with their belief of agency. I think it's much more prudent to face reality and build our moral and societal frameworks from here, and not hide behind antiquated notions of freedom. Speaking of moral and societal frameworks, nice transition. As we discussed earlier, people very closely associate their intuition of free will with their identity. As such, whenever the idea of free will is challenged, very often this leads people to feel that their very identity is being challenged. I've seen this lead people to think fatalistically. Fatalism is the belief that human beings are powerless. Fate, destiny, it's all unchangeable. So why bother? But this is a confusion, plain and simple. Free will is not the only way for things to change. None of us ascribe free will to viruses, trees, or jellyfish, but watch as they evolve, adapt, and change to their environment. The thought, free will doesn't exist. I might as well sit in bed, doom scroll capybara memes, and wait for Jesus to force me to sing about him in the afterlife, isn't a recipe for things to happen. In Powerful Young Monk, Kim tells me this is the English translation of the Thai title, which is fucking great. Zuko is presented with his branching future. He must make a choice between tyranny or treason. But this choice wasn't always on his mind. At the show's beginning, the choice was clear: tyranny. From the beginning, his destiny as the prince of his father's Fire Nation was always the path forward. And yet, in the end, treason was chosen. The environment Zuko found himself in, the influences around him, changed his beliefs about his path in life. What I mean is, fatalism is a mistake in reasoning. Change is a part of our world. If you want to learn how to live a good life, or overthrow a tyrannical Fire Lord, or support me financially on Patreon, you can't sit around and wait for that to happen to you. Your destiny isn't approaching you. You are approaching it. Change is possible, even without 18th century notions of freedom. Finally, beliefs are very important. Your behavior would drastically change if you suddenly believed that your parents or spouse don't love you. What a stupid example. However, beliefs themselves don't affect reality. You can believe that your partner doesn't love you, but this doesn't mean that they don't. So, using this framework, if not believing in free will drastically changes your willingness to get up in the morning, this says nothing about the reality around you. The world hasn't changed. You have. Every part of your life is exactly the same. The only difference is how you think about it. This isn't to belittle that belief. Again, beliefs matter. But I think it's important to point out how much the world around you has changed. None. So why should how you feel about your life or its purpose be changed? Life is still beautiful. We still get to experience the magic of existence. We're still lucky enough to be alive. We don't have to lie to ourselves. This is enough. But beliefs do matter. There's even a cohort of studies showing that prompting people to think deterministically makes them less likely to play nicely. They're more likely to cheat on a test or fall into other antisocial behavior. This begs the question, if everyone believed free will is an illusion, would we run amok? Will we run amok? Will we run amok? Will we run amok? Despite many prominent compatibilists, such as Alfred Mealy or the late Daniel Dennett, citing this as a major motivator for the compatibilist project, well, no, we wouldn't run amok. The literature on the subject truly is mixed. There are studies that show increases in cheating. However, there are also studies that show strong belief in free will correlates with willingness to harshly punish people. After all, if you really are responsible, you deserve to burn. Right? Moreover, there are some studies that, instead of prompting people to think deterministically, find people who already lack belief in free will. These subjects behave just as morally as any free will believer. This free will-fueled moral panic by compatibilists is very reminiscent of the moral panic that surrounds atheism. It's less prevalent now, but especially 10, 20 years ago, disbelief in God was equated to pernicious, vice-fueled depravity, a complete betrayal of morality itself. And it is. That's what makes it so fun. I think this is an equally superstitious fear about free will. We wouldn't descend into madness. We would only inject more understanding into our beliefs and attitudes towards other human beings. Which is a perfect segue into the final section of this video. I began this video by asking questions of punishment and blame. Does Firelord Ozai deserve the death penalty? Should we condemn Azula and praise Zuko? Does loving Diet Root Beer deserve jail time? If so, lock me up. What the fuck am I doing right now, dude? Under the philosophy of this video, people do not freely choose their own actions. Actions are the sum of your biological luck, over which you had no control, and your environmental luck, over which you had no control. Within this framework, blame makes no sense. Praise makes no sense. Hatred and pride make no sense. And honestly, they weren't much fun anyway. We cannot morally condemn a machine for carrying out its directives. There's a lot to unpack here, but fundamentally, if we cannot be said to freely choose, meritocratic intuitions of pats on the back and finger wagging are just a farce, plain and simple. Does this mean that we have to let every criminal out of prison? Does this mean we have to randomly select someone off the street to perform your grandfather's foot surgery? No, of course not. Self-defense is still a completely viable belief. If someone attacks you, you're completely free, pun intended, to fight them off. If someone is proven to be a danger to themselves or others, it's completely reasonable to proactively prevent them from causing more harm. In the case of doctors, expertise is still something to be valued. That aspect of meritocracy is sound. But what needs to change about our intuitions, our silly little criminal justice system, is the way we sneer and look down on those less fortunate than us. Human beings, the apes that we are very intoxicated with righteous punishment. In the Painfotainment episode of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, he describes the ancient and more modern ways people interacted with public displays of pain. There are so many scenes that feel infinitely foreign to me. The procuring of slaves for blood sport within the packed, cheering Roman Colosseum. The 18th century version of a tailgate for the public torture and execution of Robert Francis Damiens.
Robert François Damien.
a man who attempted to assassinate the King of France, and excited, lustful lynch mobs within the American South. The grisly details of these affairs being celebrated by contemporary spectators. This is nearly unimaginable to my sensibilities, but not completely. There are people who I 100% believe are worthy of horrible atrocity against them. We get intense satisfaction from punishing those who we believe deserve it. Schadenfreude. But this is something to fight against, something to be acutely aware of. In a controversial decision, Aang Airbender spared the life of Fire Lord Ozai. As a kid, this felt right to me. Ozai is stripped of his firebending, his power to harm others. Why would we need to go any farther? I guess that's just my disposition, but looking at this as an adult makes things much more emotionally complicated. Ozai is responsible for genocidal war efforts. How can he possibly be deserving of mercy? There's a quote in my head that I haven't been able to source about Donald J. Trump. It's to the effect of, he was born into a monster factory, and guess what came out? A monster. Given the same influences upon a person, they would turn out the same way, again and again. Sermonizing some imaginary soul into a demonic evil just isn't within the picture of reality. Look, we would put tornadoes in jail if we could. If we could confine their destructive whirlwind and protect people from harm, there wouldn't be a question. Put it in the wind tunnel. But we don't condemn this hapless force of nature as having evil intent. Well, I guess we used to. We used to attribute them to evil gods or witches, but not anymore. And yes, I understand people are not tornadoes, but they are equally byproducts of nature. Let's try and ground this in reality.
Looks like it's boiled in oil.
ACE, or Adverse Childhood Experience Score, is an illuminating modern metric. The great discipline has taught us this lesson again and again. Childhood matters. Children who experience abuse, neglect, or markers of household dysfunction carry this trauma with them into adulthood. It's easy to look at wrongdoers with the attitude, everyone has trauma in their past, that's no excuse for being a shitty person. And it is true that 61% of American adults have an ACE score of at least 1. But dealing with one adverse event far from guarantees the ability to deal with 2 or 5 or 10. There's only so much a person, a child, is capable of handling. For each additional type of adverse event reported by youth, the risk of violence perpetration increased 35 to 144%, depending on which type of violence you're talking about. These effects stack on top of each other, culminating into some horrific whirlwind of lifelong negative consequences. It's cliché, but hurt people hurt people. Just 2 more studies, I promise. Neuropsychological features of indigent unalive defendants and death row inmates surveyed 77 individuals to produce some startling statistics. 87% of the sample reported a history of closed head trauma. However, only 10% had a documented history of traumatic brain injury based on medical records. Given that these people were largely unable to afford the basic necessities of life, it's no surprise that only 10% had medical records. To paraphrase the study, consistent with previous studies, the current sample of 77 unalivers was characterized by elevated rates of developmental disorders, psychopathology, traumatic brain injury, seizure disorders, and neuropsychological dysfunction. And I bet I don't have to tell you that 68% of them were African American. Love our little criminal justice system. Two quick quotes that absolutely blew me away. First, from the same study, 14 defendants, 18% of the 77, met diagnostic criteria for an intellectual disability. From a separate study that looked at 14 of the 37 total juveniles on death row, which is a fucking insane sentence by itself, but the quote, 9 of the 14 had major neurological impairment. Only 2 had full-scale IQ scores above 90. 12 had been brutally physically abused, and 5 had been SA by relatives. You know, if you ask me, they sound like people completely in control of their own actions. Let's fry the bastards. A quick aside about IQ. There are many criticisms of IQ, but even if it's purely a cultural reflection, a learned metric, that still sheds light on the relative neglect within the lives of these individuals. And if IQ is 100% biological, how can we blame people for that? Why are we apologizing for and excusing the actions of some of the worst people on planet Earth? Shouldn't we be happy to see people like this rot in prison? The poignant analogy Sapolsky draws here is that of a sick kindergartner. When a child is sick, we ask them to stay home, so they don't endanger those around them. However, this is to say nothing of their humanity or the classification of their soul. We don't demonize the child for being sick. Instead, we quarantine them until it's safe to reintroduce them to wider society. We don't punish them, lecture them on how bad of a person they have been and always will be, or take away their toys. But this hasn't always been the case. Sickness used to be considered a punishing sign from God of your sinful ways. Subtracting responsibility from that equation didn't make society worse. It got better. We now look kindly upon those who would have felt the guilt of damnation for benign reasons. This, I believe, is the most informed and humane path forward, a quarantine model of criminal justice. The biggest change of this model is the goal. We should strive for the minimum intervention necessary to protect society from dangerous individuals. And not a step farther. Taking lessons such as painfotainment seriously, we do not punish for the sake of punishment. Punishment can still be a tool for deterrence of criminal behavior, but it should be rationed out frugally and with great suspicion of our own motives. Are we punishing because it feels good, or because it's an effective tool for the situation? If it is never an effective tool, it should never be used. No more demonization, no more righteous smiting, no more criminal justice as we know it. Great, a utopian ideal that has little to no bearing in the real world. Good luck getting America as a whole, or even a single politician, behind these ideas. I hear this criticism loud and clear as an American, but this is something that already exists in modern Scandinavia. Don't tell H. Bomber Guy, but I'm going to read from the Wikipedia article. Norway's criminal justice system focuses on the principles of restorative justice and the rehabilitation of prisoners. They have one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, with a rate of 25% after 5 years. Compare that to the US's 71% in the same time frame. They don't have the death penalty or life imprisonment. The maximum sentence is 21 years, with the ability to add 5-year increments every 5 years if the rehabilitation isn't achieved. Perhaps this is merely the perspective of a late-stage 20-something, but 20 years may as well be the rest of my life. As a deterrence, I'm not sure how much more effective life in prison is compared to 20 years. I suspect there is no difference. I'm not claiming to know the ins and outs of their criminal justice system. I'm no expert. But there are real-life examples of kindness and humanity being injected into criminal justice. Why wouldn't we follow suit? Isn't this a bleak picture of reality? If you want to remove responsibility and praise and blame, are you saying I don't deserve where I am in life? Are you saying my hard work, my grit, my determination aren't praiseworthy? I think it's useful to separate praise as a moral statement and praise as a tool or expression of goodwill. We shouldn't condemn hyper-unlucky people. Likewise, we shouldn't commend hyper-lucky people for having the luck that they have had. By virtue of having a loving family, or a high-paying job, or the ability to focus and study, or the ethic of working hard, or internet access, or clean drinking water, you have been blessed by Lady Fortune in a multitude of ways. We shouldn't morally praise you for the happenstance of being born where you were. What are the chances your life would have gone the same if you grew up with malaria and tuberculosis, or the neighboring warlord, as everyday worries? Our experience of growing up surrounded by wealth and resources shouldn't lead to our surprise and subsequent praise at being able to amass some for ourselves. And I'm not talking about wealthy people in an American sense. Even people living in relative poverty in the West, myself among them, still have internet access, AC, and a microwave, the height of luxury. That was written as a joke, but it's a serious point. My life as one of the poorest Americans is still far more comfortable than the experience of the poorest 3 billion with the goddamned B people on planet Earth. Do you deserve your high-paying job or loving spouse or college degree because you worked for it? No. Your ability to have worked for it in the first place is something that was gifted to you. So let's use our luck and be good citizens of Earth. Let's strive for a future with a little luck for everyone. But, as I said before, praise as a tool or expression of endearment is still entirely sensible. If a child does something that we want to encourage, we praise them. This isn't an example of moral bankruptcy. If our partner looks good today, we praise them. Not out of an expression of moral superiority, but out of an expression of love. By the way, you look cute today, Kim. No, you don't deserve your life, but neither do the unfortunate among us. By virtue of your speaking English and watching an hour-long video on free will, you're highly likely to live a privileged life. We should rejoice in the fact that we're able to live lives as full, nourished, and wonderful as we do. We're the lucky ones. Human beings are intensely complex. We're capable of pure altruism and malicious wrongdoing. Looking only at the end result, this person committed a crime or this person got a promotion, removes 99% of the story, and thus our basis for compassion. For a final quote from Zadie Sapolsky, "This is like reviewing a book only having read the last paragraph. How did you come to be the kind of person that would make that decision in the first place?" The more we come to know about other human beings, the less rational hatred or praise or blame become. I'm an ape too, a Homo sapien. This isn't the easy way to view the criminality of other humans or our own achievements, but it is the right way. In Dr. Fatima's essay, Who's Right About Pluto?, She asks the viewer to comment on what other Plutos are out there. Pluto's planet status being used as a symbol of those things we learned as children. Super simplified versions of things that some people latch onto, refusing to let go of, even though we are now adults with access to a wealth of complicating knowledge.
And especially, are any of these other rhetorical Plutos hurting us?
From my perspective, convincing you that there's absolutely no free will isn't super likely. However, convincing you that there's far less of it going around than generally assumed, I think leads one to many of the same conclusions about criminality and society. We must move forward into the future with compassion and grace. As I've heard Hank Green say, everybody's themself. And even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, we need to embrace kindness about that fact. Not very good with carbonation. Thank you so much for watching. It means the world that anyone would take this much time to listen to me speak.
It's so bubbly.
If you made it this far, please consider engaging with the video, boosting the algorithm,
chug this.
or even consider supporting my future attempts at video essays on Patreon. Don't forget to show love to those around you. I appreciate you.
Not quite
Good
like
luck out
spicy,
there.
but like carbonation, like bubbly, like wasabi, saw. I'm feeling intense saw right now, dude. I'm not gonna finish. This is not worth it. I'm not finishing this.